Okay, Offsets 101, what you need to know about carbon offsets. We're Kelley and Elizabeth from EDF. So here's the situation, and if you're in this session, you already know that this is the reality. You are here attending Verge, GreenBiz. You know we have a very big climate tragedy taking place right now. And we have an urgent need for action in this next 10 years. Emissions must be cut in half in the next decade, and it is critical that we reach net zero carbon dioxide emissions around 2050. In particular, it is really important that we dramatically limit the release of short-lived climate pollutants like methane. Our scientific understanding here is growing, and the need for reducing methane is super critical. It is going to be a big part of the solution of achieving a stable climate, and is a bigger part of the problem right now. We know business leadership will be critical to get us there. It was critical when we, the past 4 years in the United States, when we've had an administration that hasn't been supportive. It is super critical right now to show the way. So why net zero? In 2018, the IPCC special report really identified increasing threats. And the message was loud and clear. We are not moving fast enough. And our inaction to date just means we really need to step up both emissions reductions and removals of CO2 and other greenhouse gases to avoid the worst effects of climate change. So here's what needs to happen for companies and businesses. Companies should have shorter-term science-based decarbonization targets. They must focus on short-lived climate pollutants, as I mentioned. We're seeing that about half of warming until 2050 will be caused by short-lived climate pollutants. So they are increasingly, we're refining our understanding of the importance of action on methane, which means action in the ag sector and on waste and on reducing methane emissions from oil and gas. And finally, we really need to act with urgency right now to protect the world's carbon stocks. And that means in particular, tropical forests as a great example. The question here is, what is the role of offsets or carbon credits to get there? I'm going to walk you through the basic pathway to net zero from a company perspective. Of course, you start by measuring your emissions because you can't manage what you don't measure. So measure your scope 1 and 2 or your operational emissions, and your scope 3 or your supply chain or value chain emissions. Project those emissions into the future, 2030 and beyond to 2050 actually. Adopt a science-based target and then implement emissions reductions to achieve that science-based target. So what is a science-based target? They are basically greenhouse gas emission targets that align an organization's emissions over time with a reduction pathway that is necessary to limit warming to a certain temperature in line with science. The last steps are adopt ambitious near-term mitigation plans and purchase carbon credits to account for ongoing emissions, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And finally, at the very end, implement and invest in carbon removals over time to balance remaining emissions. So there's a critical point to be made here. Everyone's talking about net zero, and what I'm finding is that there's some confusion about what net zero means for the planet versus for a company. The two are different. As a planet, we need to achieve around net zero greenhouse gas emissions we need to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions around mid-century. And for what we cannot reduce, we need to remove at around mid-century. For a company, it's a different story. Net zero looks different at the company level. First, a company absolutely, first and foremost, must reduce its own emissions as much and as fast as possible. But you know, unfortunately, that's not enough. Reducing your own emissions means your scope 1 and 2, so your own electricity, any fuel that you burn on site. Those are your operational emissions. You also need to reduce your scope 3 emissions, your supply chain emissions, but also it's critically important that companies prioritize actions outside the value chain to avoid and reduce emissions. For a company, it is not it does not make sense to focus or rely on removals right now at this point. That said, it is important to invest in early stage removal technology that needs to come to scale, and that is in the removal category. But the point about not focusing and relying on removals at this point is a broader one, which is there are many things that need to happen right now that fall into an avoid or reduce category of offsets, and that is, for example, helping save tropical forests.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So I'm going to take over here and set out some of the basics of carbon credits in the voluntary carbon market. Elizabeth, can you just nod if you can hear me, because it kicked me out a minute ago. I just want to make sure. Okay, thanks. So high quality carbon credits can accelerate near and medium term mitigation opportunities. And I'm going to go into an example of that in a minute. They can also speed up the low carbon transition, but in order to do so, they must have clear environmental integrity, and they have to be integrated in a clear pathway to decarbonization. So more generally, the use of carbon markets can increase the level of climate ambition while cutting the cost of doing so. So a couple of years ago, about 3 years ago, EDF, maybe 2 years ago, EDF did some modeling that shows that a global carbon market, including tropical forest protection, can double the ambition of the Paris Agreement commitments at no extra cost. So we can get 100% more out of countries at zero extra cost if we really deploy the power of markets, including tropical forest protection. And just to underline that, IETA, along with the University of Maryland, did similar modeling using a different model and got the same results. So that's the International Emissions Trading Association. And those are pretty powerful results. Next slide. Here, I'm just going to give a numeric example of how carbon credits can contribute to faster, more ambitious climate action. And this is based on real company data and was prepared for us by our consultants at NG Impact. So on the left, we have a company that reduced their emissions consistent with a science-based target and invest in removals as part of that goal. And the total abatement they have from just reductions and removals is about 2.5 million tons of CO2 equivalent. On the right, we have a company that also reduces their emissions. Oh, back one.
Sorry, Kelley, give me a second.
No problem. There we go.
I'm having a really hard time with Happen.
On the right, we also have a company that reduces its emissions.
Okay, we're back.
Consistent with a science-based target, but along the way, they use carbon credits to address residual emissions. And in this case, the total abatement by the company is 9 million tons. And this is a contribution to climate action far and away above the approach without investment in carbon credits. So you can see how that investment alone can accelerate climate action in the nearer term to address residual emissions on a pathway consistent with net zero. And that's why we talk about the near to medium term, because it's something that companies can do to address emissions that they can't mitigate right now. And we know that there are some emissions that are simply too costly to mitigate right now for all sorts of reasons, right? Sunk investment, responsibility shareholders, but it's important that we don't stop acting just because of that. Next. And this is maybe a little bit of a pain point, but I think if we want to talk about carbon credits, we need to go through some of the terminology often used. So a carbon credit is often also called a carbon offset or just an offset. To be even more confusing, the term offset is also used as a verb, but what it is, it's an environmental commodity that represents the reduction, avoidance, or removal of 1 metric ton of CO2 equivalent compared to a projected baseline. Subcategories include carbon reduction or avoidance credits, and these are credits that reduce or avoid emissions that would have happened in the absence of the activity, or carbon removal credits that remove through natural or technological means CO2 from the atmosphere and durably store it. You'll hear a lot about MRV, which just means monitoring, reporting, and verification. You might hear about VVBs, which are validation and verification bodies. And offset activities require third-party validation and verification. And this is carried out by accredited third-party VVBs. Methodologies is like a document that sets out the detailed procedures for quantifying the greenhouse gas benefits of a project, provide guidance to determine the project boundaries, to set the baseline, which is the level, which is what's used for crediting, to assess the additionality, and to quantify the GHG emission reductions. Additionality is a term you're going to hear a lot about. It's really fundamental to carbon credits. And it's the concept that a project or activity leads to emission reductions that are additional to those that would have happened in the absence of the incentive generated by the crediting mechanism. So the goal is not to issue offsets for an activity that would have happened anyway, right? This is an activity that needed that investment in order to happen. The baseline or the baseline scenario is the most likely emission scenario in the absence of the crediting mechanism. It's your business as usual emissions. And the baseline sets the level against which emission reductions or removals are determined. So you set a baseline, and then you reduce your emissions, and you credit that delta. That's how carbon credit projects work. Leakage is really important because it refers to increased emissions outside of the project or program boundaries as a result of the activity within the boundary. That's confusing language, but what it basically means is you choose a small puddle of forest and you protect it. So what happens is the loggers go next door and just deforest the acreage right next to where you are. And you end up with a puddle of green and a sea of brown. That's called leakage. So you haven't really contributed to climate action. And so activities have to determine how they're going to address something like leakage also by drawing their boundaries. And permanence is the requirement that an activity has measures in place to manage situations in which emission reductions or removals are reversed. So a forest fire puts the CO2 back into the atmosphere, or mismanagement where the forest rots puts the CO2 back into the atmosphere. There are natural reversals and otherwise, and basically what this means is that the carbon isn't stored or reduced, for geological time, for a long period of time, and so it's not really addressing climate change. Next. I also want to touch upon the issue of scale. So over time, we need to move away from project-based approaches to activities implemented at a jurisdictional scale. The timeline for this transition is different for different activities, but it's very relevant today for tropical forest protection. So carbon market activities can be implemented at a project scale, where credits are issued on the basis of emissions reduced, removed, or avoided within a limited and standalone project boundary confined to a relatively small area. But they can also be implemented on a jurisdictional scale. And this is where credits are issued on the basis of emission reduction, removals, and avoidance across an entire jurisdiction, right? And the benefits of a jurisdictional approach are manyfold, and in particular for tropical forest protection. So these kind of approaches involve national or state level governments, and governments are often essential because activities like halting and reversing deforestation and forest degradation on a large scale require actions that only governments can perform, like policing illegal logging, regulating land or permit disputes. Those kind of issues really require government involvement, so there's a big benefit to jurisdictional approaches. Private sector investment in these kind of approaches is hugely important because although public sector finance is certainly part of the solution, it'll never be sufficient for the changes that we really need. And that's especially true for larger emerging market economies. Jurisdictional approaches have clear benefits with regard to leakage, right? Because you're implementing the activity over a much larger area, so we're less likely to see that puddle of green in a sea of brown. And for additionality and for reversals, because you're less likely to see reversals over a large area, or you're taking them into account on a broader scale. And I think really importantly, especially in today's environment, these type of approaches can help to ensure that local communities are protected and that their benefit is ensured. And something near and dear to my heart, the jurisdictional approach to tropical forest protection in particular is also consistent with the Paris Agreement. Next slide. And we hear a lot about reductions versus removals. Elizabeth's already touched on this, but I want to kind of address it in more detail. It's true that the science says that we need to reduce our emissions as far as possible and then address residual emissions through removals. This needs to happen around mid-century. So this means that as we get closer to 2050, if we're doing our job, our potential to reduce emissions should decrease, and the importance of removals grows. This is unfortunately not where we are today. The bath is full and the tap is still running. So we need to both reduce and remove emissions to be consistent with the science. If we don't reduce emissions from tropical deforestation in this decade, so in this decade, we can't be on a path to net zero. That's it, it's game over. We have 10 years to really do that. And planting trees is important, and I'm not trying to take away the importance, but it can never take the place of forest protection because forests take such a long time to grow. So you can see here what would happen. It takes a forest about a century before it's able to store the same amount of carbon it did before it was destroyed. Next slide. How big is the voluntary market? I think with this, what I really want to show is the incredible growth that we've seen in the voluntary market in recent years. And I want to point out that most of that is driven by company net zero goals. So the voluntary market is having a massive renaissance right now, and that's really important. So it's improving its techniques and its reach and the amount of investment it represents every year, and that's largely driven by company climate action. Next slide. With that comes a lot of complexity, right? So there's some blurring between the lines for voluntary and compliance markets. Company setting net zero goals has skyrocketed, but a lot of those are absent detailed plans for achieving them. Every country in the world under the Paris Agreement has NDCs, and this means that some of the reduction and removals are necessary to achieve those NDCs. And that means some countries, and in particular developing countries, may be unwilling to sell those credits because they want to keep them to achieve Paris Agreement goals. And we can work on that through accounting to make sure we can achieve both things. The Article 6 rules. Article 6 is the article in the Paris Agreement that deals with carbon markets, and it is also the last part of the Paris Agreement that does not yet have an agreed rule set. A lot of it because of some of these complexities. There are some inherent challenges related to leakage and permanence for nature-based solution offsets, even though they are by far the most popular kind. There's a lack of clear guidance from NGOs, from government, from everywhere, or conflicting guidance from standard setters or norm setters about how offsets can be used or which offsets you should buy. And the science is evolving, right? So we are the science has been resolved for tropical forests, but we are still working on the science for soil carbon and for blue carbon and for some of the measurement protocols. Technology is helping a lot. Next slide. But the main message here is that companies can't wait to sort out all of the complexity. Perfect can't stand in the way of the good. Companies have to act now, even given the complexity and lack of clarity. And don't worry, there are many initiatives that are trying to resolve the issues of quality and claims and accounting to make sure real climate progress is being made. And we are continuously improving our techniques on this. Next. This is just a review of some of the big initiatives. They're not all here. These are some that EDF are involved in, but there are some really important initiatives. The Science-Based Target Initiative is right now finalizing its net zero guidance. That will be hugely important because thousands of companies have science-based targets that are certified by the SBTi. The Natural Climate Solutions Alliance is a WEF alliance looking to maximize the contribution of nature-based solutions to climate action. The Business Alliance to Scale Climate Solutions is something EDF is involved in, and we've got several major companies coming together to really make an impact on climate action. The Voluntary Carbon Markets Initiative is just kicking off this week, and we'll be looking at a lot of these demand side issues, how and when and under what circumstances should companies use offsets. The LEAVE Coalition involves the UK government, the US government, the government of Norway, and several major companies who have contributed $1 billion to invest in tropical forest protection at jurisdictional scale. That just launched in April, and that's the kind of thing where we can really move the goalpost. We also have, at the bottom corner, you can see the task force for voluntary, to scale the voluntary carbon market. That was an initiative launched by Mark Carney, who is the former head of the Bank of England and the Bank of Canada, has gotten a lot of high profile, and they're really looking at the supply side, so the quality issues in the voluntary carbon market, and they're going to stand up a governance body to govern the voluntary carbon market before November. Next. One of our initiatives, so we're involved in a lot of those that you saw before, but we've also worked with the World Wildlife Fund and Germany's UCO Institute to work on a carbon credit quality guide. What we want to accomplish here is to provide comprehensive, clear, and independent guidance for stakeholders across all sectors that want high quality carbon credits. So we have a chapter already published, an introduction to carbon credits. We're going to address the possible types of claims that can be made, the criteria and methodology to assess credit quality, how to interpret the methodology and present the findings. And we want to do this so that we can help companies identify high quality carbon credit projects, and to help civil society and NGOs and other interested entities that want to assess offsetting claims by companies. And also to put the market on a path to continuous improvement over time. Next. So we need companies acting and purchasing high quality credits now. And some of our key messages are: don't limit your climate action to your own operational and supply chain emissions. Look to see what else you can do outside of those, including through the purchase of carbon credits. We should all be looking to move towards jurisdictional approaches over time, and in particular now for tropical forest protection. We need companies to be very transparent about their climate action and how they're using carbon credits toward these goals. Some of the criticism comes from just a lack of clarity, right? And the more clarity we have, the less open to criticism our companies are going to be. And we need companies and stakeholders to really help to shape the systems of accounting and claiming. What can be used under what circumstances? I think this is important for all of us, and we all need to have a voice in that. Next slide. Thank you very much. So I think we're happy to answer any questions that anybody has. It's a lot to go over, and I'm sure we didn't address many things, and we can try to address them during questions. Thank you.
Kelley, it looks like there's a couple questions in the, do you want to mute yourself and then I'll ask the questions and then we'll go back and forth here. A couple comments, questions from Alexander. I understand, assuming additionality and no leakage, that a benefit has occurred, but it feels like nothing has changed, but someone has gained a credit. That this is the avoidance offsets, the question of avoidance offsets, right around avoidance versus removal offsets. And in essence, I agree with you, Alexander. Why should someone get credit for not ripping down a forest? I mean, that just seems nonsensical. But the reality is that there are immense pressures on tropical forests, right? For soy, for beef, for palm oil, for paper and forest products, and those economic pressures are not lessening, right? And so there needs to be some way to ensure that the forests are protected, that local people and communities have a way to have income apart from deforestation. So the use of offsets is really meant to support that path. And that's when you consider that that's going to happen anyway, it makes the case that avoidance credits are really critical. As Kelley said, there is no path without protecting forests. There is no path to climate stability without doing that. So how do we best do that? There's a lot of different strategies. Supply chain companies use byproducts that are certified. Consumers demand products that do not deforest. But one other important tool in the tool chest is offsets. And in my mind, it's almost like a marketing problem, right? A labeling problem. Avoidance doesn't sound as good or sexy as removal, but the reality is that that's just as important, if not more important. Kelley, what would you say?
There's a few questions I would answer here, but this is why I said additionality is so important in carbon credits. Like, we are not rewarding someone for keeping a forest standing that was going to remain standing. That's not the point. We're protecting forests that would otherwise not remain standing. We're keeping forests. And they're being cut down for all sorts of reasons, all of them financial, right? So what you have to do is provide an alternative financial incentive to keep them standing. So if we do nothing, they will fall. We are not paying for carbon credits for a forest that would have remained forest anyway. That would be against the principle of additionality, and that would be greenwashing, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about providing an incentive to keep forests instead of the existing incentives to cut them down. So inaction is not a net beneficial activity. The point is there would be action to cut these forests down. It's actually not an avoidance credit, it's a reduction credit. And when you're talking about a jurisdictional sale, you're reducing emissions through tropical forest protection.
Hey, Kelley, when do we go ahead? Sorry.
So Blake has mentioned the Cool Effect Buyer's Guide, and it is an amazing guide, and it gives some very practical advice to buyers. It was prepared by SEI and GHGMI, and actually we've involved some of those authors in our project too. We work really closely with them, but I'm really glad that you provided that resource because it's amazing. And also the phase 1 of our project is already published, and the second phase, which is the methodology for reviewing credit quality, is out next week. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I was just going to ask that question. There was the question on when the carbon credit buyer's guide is gonna be created. Lots of questions about just getting some more help, right? Is there a database of consultants for carbon credits and carbon intensity? How do you navigate this really complex space? What would you recommend, Kelley?
I think the carbon credit buyer's guide, the Cool Effect published is very good. I think the work we're doing is very good. There are many consultants you can reach out to me offline that I could recommend depending on what you want to do, that are working in this space. So there are a lot of initiatives that you can connect into, and a lot of carbon market nerds around willing to offer advice. Unfortunately, I don't know of a database that just has a list of consultants and how they work, but I mean, you can use LinkedIn as everybody's database.
Yeah, I might put in a plug for the Business Alliance to Scale Climate Solutions, which is just recently launched. It's a number of NGOs, EDF, WWF, and also the UN, and a number of companies. And the whole idea is that it is a virtual table around which companies can gather to try and learn about the voluntary carbon market, and also just basically increasing climate finance. So beyond carbon credits, carbon offsets, and to direct carbon or climate finance. So investing in projects or efforts that maybe tie to your supply chain and can help, spark innovation or protect forests that are outside the markets. So that I think that effort is one that is attempting to try and help companies along with tools and understanding, because it is a complex space, and it's a hard learning curve to get up. I think there are a number of consultants that really understand this space well, and can help navigate things. And I think ultimately the goal of a lot of these initiatives is, ours is focused on defining quality. Others are focused on defining, what can companies claim. Others are focused on getting the supply side right. And so it's just, I think all of these efforts are really aimed at both simplifying things, clarifying things, and increasing action. But this is just the voluntary carbon market. Maybe, Kelley, you can speak a little bit to how you see this fitting into the the regulated carbon market and Article 6 in Paris and the COP that's coming up.
Yeah, there was a couple other questions here, and then we can come back to that broader connection, because I think it's really important. I mean, when it comes down to it, the answer to that question is we are not going to hit net zero voluntarily, which is not possible. It's really important that companies, on top of their own climate action, including action outside of their own operations and supply chain, support strong climate policy, because that's what we're going to need. We're going to need government level action supported by business. And like I said, in any given jurisdiction, or even in a plurilateral arrangement, carbon markets can make the cost of climate action less expensive. And we need to be seizing onto those efficiencies, because we've waited so long. It's 2021 and we're in a bit of trouble. So we need to be able to do this in a way that doesn't tank the global economy. So we need to be finding reductions where they're least expensive and where there are the most potential for them, while also making sure that we're taking care of local communities and we're looking at complementary policies. So I think what Article 6 of the Paris Agreement tries to do is encourage international cooperation through carbon markets. And the voluntary carbon market can really catalyze some of that effort and be part of some of that effort. But over time, we need to be looking at more and more regulated approaches. And it's important that companies support that. I have a question from Elijah. How can you verify that a given forest would have been logged at any potential level, either responsibly or totally clear cut? So this is, there's a very complicated practice of setting the baselines for crediting, and they're based on different approaches. Many of them use recent historical data, establishing the recent deforestation rates and then reducing those rates. So it's actually, data driven based on what's happening now. And then
I think Tui asked an interesting question about, should all credits be moving towards jurisdictional approach, not just REDD+ or tropical forest credits? And I think that's a really interesting question.
Over time, we're going to need, if we really want to maximize the benefit of carbon markets, and also the benefits that can happen in terms of private and public sector investment in developing countries, we need to be generating these transfers at scale, right? So jurisdictional approaches national level approaches with multi-sector coverage are the ideal. That's where we need to be going. And I think there are some complexities depending on the activity that really recommend a jurisdictional approach now. And I think tropical forests are one of them. I think the projects for tropical forest protection were really important, and we learned an awful lot from them. But I think they can be complementary with a broader jurisdictional approach, and we're really working to see how we can make those important project-based approaches be complementary to jurisdictional approaches over time in the next sort of 5-10 years.
I also like Tatiana's question. She says, are carbon credits a suitable solution if they don't address the impact of the infinite pursuit of growth on the planet? No, it's a tool in the tool chest, right? It is meant to speed climate action and maximize climate ambition. And so I think if we think about it like that, and we think about the fact that carbon credits are really useful in the short and medium term, it doesn't address the underlying drivers of consumption, but it is really meant to create another mechanism to get money to support efforts that otherwise just would not happen, and for companies to invest in that.
I think Claudia's asked a really important question, which is about the motivation of governments to protect forests and to restore forests. And I think, with only public sector finance, it's probably not going to happen. But if those governments and those oligarchs that you've mentioned can see a real investment benefit, including private sector investment for keeping forests, yes, it'll make a change. Follow the money. It really does matter, this kind of investment, and can change minds pretty drastically.
Yeah, I like the idea of the Citizens Climate Corps. That reminds me that EDF has had a Climate Corps program for a long time that helps companies by putting grad students in for a summer to try and help really deal with climate change opportunities within the company and to create a business case for doing so. So the more that we can, that companies can set really ambitious net zero goals and have short-term targets, and also have the help that they need, and governments can have the help that they need from, folks like a Climate Corps, I think that's just going to speed action faster. When you look at the challenge ahead and the utter transformation of the economy that needs to take place in the next 10 years, it can be really daunting. But the truth is that we have a lot of, we just have a lot of tools in the tool chest, and credits are one of them, and they really can help in the short term to try and do some of these things that otherwise just would not happen.
Thanks, everybody. And Blake, you had a point. We should make the methodologies more strict. I agree. We need continuous improvement for these methodologies over time. The standard setting bodies do an amazing job at thinking about quality, and they think about it all the time, and they are constantly changing and upping their standards, but they need all the help they can get to push for those improvements and to balance out, the desire to generate a bunch of credits and the desire to have the perfect quality, right? So we need all the voices in the game to make sure that they do continuous improvement. They're looking at it right now, and they need the help and the push as well.
Richard also has a question about the Conservation Reserve Program, and that maybe brings up the point that there are a lot of agricultural credits too, and soil carbon credits that really have, what we have found, and EDF just did a study on this, what we have found is there's a lot of confusion and different results with soil carbon credits. The truth is there's a lot of opportunity in soil carbon in terms of, we need for sure to support the preservation of soil carbon. And in addition, many of the practices that result in soil carbon have a lot of co-benefits that relating to cleaner air, cleaner water, quality soils. So it is really about taking that bigger picture. For a carbon credit, you're going to engage in the carbon market, and we need the USDA to step up and to help with standardization and robustness on the soil carbon credit side. But there's plenty of other reasons to do this work, and I think the same is really true on the tropical forest side in terms of benefit to Indigenous peoples and support for communities and getting funding to areas that need it, and to projects and efforts that really need it. So a lot of really good reasons in addition to helping solve climate change to do this work.
And then I'll take two last questions, and I will be finishing at 1/4 or 1/2.
Finishing at 12, finishing it in 1 minute.
1 minute, okay. So there's a question here about combining carbon credits with blockchain. There are a lot of people thinking about this and very interested in blockchain technology and how it would apply to the carbon market. So if you follow up offline, I can get that to you. Thank you, Alwyn. I was wondering when the blockchain question would come. And Claudia and Elijah, yes, I think the goal is not to degrow, but it's to decouple the growth in CO2 emissions and GHG emissions more broadly with the economic growth and population growth that's definitely going to continue to happen. The EU has already successfully done this decoupling, and all nations need to follow. So historically, as your economy grew, your emissions grew. We need to break that pattern.
Good. Was there anything else, Kelley, you wanted to end on?
Thank you so much for the great questions. I mean, that was really interactive and spot on for people who always said, I don't know much about this, but then asked the absolutely most relevant questions. So thank you guys. Thank you very much.
Agree. Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
Yep. Bye, Kelley. Bye, everybody.